Thank you very much. So yes, as introduced, today's talk is on the topic of string figures exclusively. But the other talk I'm giving in most order will be also on body-based measurement systems, which is a related, cryptic, strange topic I've been working on. So I assume this isn't common knowledge. What is a string figure? You might not know. In case you don't, you start working with an open loop string. It can be a short one like this, or a rather long one like this one. String figures are always made from an open loop by definition. So you have all other kinds of string games available, but string figures are always. And then you start applying rules. So you can start with, this is called position 1. And you start with opening A, and you can start kind of applying this mental algorithm that you might have been practicing. Eventually, you will get something like this string figure here. This is a Melanesian string figure. It's from Fiji. It's very typical to a string figure of that region. And in fact, what the Fijians have discovered here is a generalizable kind of algorithm that you can keep on applying. It's a bit trickier. However, we should get an ever more complex version of the same string figure, which is, I think truly amazing, and a display of that kind of ethnomathematical knowledge that is prevalent, especially well in culture around the world. Like I'll show. Let's see if this works. It did. And then you can resolve the whole thing back into the open loop, which is called the unnot algorithm. So that's just one of hundreds or even thousands, well, probably thousands of string figures known to mankind. So string figures are, so what, why care about string figures? It's all nice. It's a nice little trick, maybe a nice party trick. However, I think the cultural significance goes way, way beyond this. So in fact, string figures are one of the most widespread games across cultures worldwide. And as such, I think it has significance in itself. Also, I will show in this talk that string figures are completely formalizable. You can give them a mathematical description. Everything to do with string figures can in fact be given formal descriptions, which 3 makes them a very good medium to study cultural transmission, because you have like a perfectly formalizable cultural trait that you can use to study even like cultural contact and innovation and so on. And 4th, based on these 3 points, I will also discuss the role of string figures, perhaps, and the role of the emergence of mathematical cognition across cultures worldwide. This talk is based on a paper of which a preprint is available. It's co-authored by a couple of people here, Elena and Felix, but also Matt Walsh from the National Museum at Copenhagen, Alison Henrik, who's a nut theorist, a mathematician at the University of Seattle, Izzy Wisher, also based here in Aarhus, and Jussi and Mikael, my colleagues from Helsinki. But yes, it's all available there. There's a document of this paper and also like tons and tons of supplementary materials if you're really interested in the deep stuff. In this talk, I'll actually only be scratching a tiny bit of surface from that paper. So just first, I think an overview is in place, like truly why I care about string figures. As I said, it is very much a global phenomenon. So here is just our sample of the societies represented in our data set. Actually, there's even more data available from cultures all over the world. Basically, you have pretty much all regions covered. People play this game I showed just before, not that specific for you, but play with an open loop in all corners of the world. Really, the only area not covered is Central Asia, but if you've ever done cross-cultural anthropology, you'll know that that's very often the case, regardless of the topic. So I think there might even be something we haven't discovered from this region, or we as in Western Post. So early explorers, early anthropologists, early ethnographers were quick to notice this. So for instance, you have descriptors like this from Alfred Russel Wallace's memoirs from the Malay archipelago. So he's documenting here his encounter with Dayak children in Borneo, I believe. And he's trying to impress them with his English simple cat's cradle figure, and then these kids, these local kids, really surprise him with all the more complex and intricate figures they can make. And this kind of sparked this general boom on the topic of studying string figures. even so far as Alfred Corte had him saying that any kind of self-respecting anthropologists should carry a loop string with them during their travels, because they might use this as a medium to establish contact with local people, to establish rapport, or just more generally collect interesting ethnographic data. So in the early 20th century, we actually have this boom. It's amazing. Like not a lot of people know this, but string figures were a major topic of anthropological study in the early 20th century. So all these famous anthropologists like Franz Boas or Diogenes or Julia Averkieva from then the USSR, from Karelia actually, collected amazing sets of string figures from all over Western North America. And I think for the Danish, Knud Rasmussen might be the most relevant example here. He also collected tons of string figures from the Inuit during his Tule expeditions. However, the most important work, I think, from this early 20th century is by Caroline Furniss-Jane, pictured here by some famous Impressionist painter, I believe. Caroline Furniss-Jane came from a family of researchers, of scientists, so she was well established to write a book on string figures that was published in 1906. It's this one, String Figures and How to Make Them. Pictured here are some string figures from Nauru. It's actually available online if you want to have a look at some internet archive. The copyright has expired. So the reason why they had all this interest is, of course, in the then emerging concept of cultural diffusion. So the idea was that because people are playing the same game all over the world, then perhaps they could use string figures as a medium to study patterns of cultural transmission or cultural diffusion around the world. Like here, it's this book by Jane is reviewed actually in Nature of all journals, so it clearly made a splash in the academic domain. So what these documents look like is often like this. This is actually from Knud Rasmussen's book on the intellectual culture of the copper Eskimos, his documentation of copper Inuit string figures. As you can see, it's very kind of meticulous, very elaborate. They really paid a lot of attention. I scanned this copy. I found it from the deep archives of the Finnish Literature Society. It had actually never been opened before. So we're truly breaking ground here, I know. Yeah, amazing. Like there's like 30 pages of this stuff there. I have the scanned copy if someone wants it. However, as you may know, in academia, trends come and go. So then around the 1960s, I believe there just emerged this gradual pessimism, I think, in the more kind of postmodern anthropology that, you can't really say anything. Like this guy, literally, Paul Silto says that you can't really say anything about cultural diffusion by using string figures. I hope to demonstrate here that I would very much disagree with this take, although, I mean, I must say, of course, the early anthropologists, they went overboard totally with some of their claims, but still there was an inkling of interest there. And I think the challenge today is kind of finding more empirically grounded middle ground here. And especially since, we now have computers and everything, we can study string figures in much more depth. And I think the case was mostly that the early ethnographers really lacked the methodological tools to deal with all this data they collected. Well, meanwhile, whilst academics were having their debates, there emerged a citizen science of string figures. You could say that it started perhaps with Honor Maud's work. Honor Maud was based in the Pacific. Her husband, Henry Evans Maud, was some kind of a colonial administrator in that region. So Honor Maud had lots of time to travel around the Pacific and Oceania and collected hundreds and hundreds of string figures from that region. Later in 1978, the International String Figure Association, that exists, just so you know. I'm a member myself. It is a fantastic association. So it's I would say it's the most amazing citizen science organization I've ever seen. They even have their own journal, the Bulletin, which I think matches any kind of peer-reviewed journal out there. It's truly amazing. So they've analyzed hundreds of otherwise forgotten documents from early ethnographies. So there's like one case where a young ethnographer called A. Bernard Deacon passed away and at the age of like 26 somewhere. It was in Malakula today in Vanuatu, I think. And then these documents were lost for 100 years, and these people, Mark Sherman, actually dug that up and analyzed that whole data set. And it's fantastic. You have to look this up if you're interested. So altogether, from this early work on string figures from academics, but also from citizen scientists, we could collect this amazing sample that we have, which covers 826 string figures from 92 societies or cultures around the world. But like I said, there's actually even more out there. This data set is, by the way, available online on OSF. Only one person has downloaded so far, so maybe have a look. So this is our sample. All the dots here represent one culture or one place where data is available, and the shapes vary by the economy of that society. So as you can see, there's a huge diversity of hunter-gatherer societies, industrial societies, horticultural societies, and so on, pastoral societies who've made string figures. So it's truly like, I wouldn't say like entirely universal, but something as close as we get. I mean, next to something like language, I suppose. So people are playing this game all over the world. And the blue dots, by the way, represent the cultures represented in the standard cross-cultural sample, which is just a nice way to gather or analyze a relatively independent set of cultures. So what to do with all this data? Now we enter the methodological section, which involves a branch of mathematics called knot theory. Knot theory is a study of mathematical knots. So if you've ever tied a knot, you'll know that it leaves loose ends. Mathematical knots are a bit different in that they never leave any loose ends. So they're always closed, like this string figure here. So a very useful trait of string figures is that they are mathematical knots. In fact, they are the simplest of all mathematical knots. That is the unknot. Every string figure out there is always an unknot, and we can show it mathematically, which is very useful. Knot theory has had all kinds of applications. It started with this interest in fundamental physics, but today it's used in DNA modeling and all kinds of stuff. However, for our purpose, we'll return to the very roots of knot theory. This guy, that's Carl Friedrich Gauss. That's his signature from when he was 17. You can see he was interested in knots at a very young age. However, Gauss, I mean, he pioneered knot theory and so many other domains of mathematics, but he developed this method, which is today known as Gauss code or Gauss notation. So here we'll use as an example the trefoil knot, which is the simplest non-trivial knot. That's the simplest knot that isn't the unknot. I realized yesterday that it's actually a very apt example, because if you look at this Mjolnir here, you'll notice that there is a trefoil knot there. So that's actually a common motif in Viking symbolism, as are many other mathematical knots actually. So how does Gauss coding work? Well, first we take this knot and we choose the point, any arbitrary point on this knot. That's called the base point. And then we choose a direction. It's called the orientation that we're following in our Gauss coding. And then we just simply, you can imagine you're a little ant here and you're moving across the knot, and you'll start labeling every crossing you encounter. So here's crossing number 1, and there's number 2. And because it's a trefoil knot, it has three crossings. And then this, by the way, it's a good time to pay a little bit of attention. What actually happens is that you go and follow it again, and every time you go under the crossing, it's recorded as a negative crossing. So it will go through here, and that will be a -1, and then we're going above, so it's +2, -3, and then we're back at this crossing. It's going to be a +1 this time, -2, and +3. And that is a Gauss code for the trefoil knot. And you can actually repeat this for any string figure. You can do the exact same thing. I'm not going to go through that, but just trust me, you can do it. This is one of the more famous string figures. I'll return to it later. It's called the Jacob's ladder, but you can give it this Gauss code that's represented here of length 54 numbers. And like I said, all string figures are the unknot. They are topologically in the unknot. They'll always remain it that way. So you can actually use mathematical tools. In this case, Martin Probert of the International String Figure Association has developed the string figure analyzer, actually originally designed for the design of string figures. So when hobbyists are making their own string figures, they'll want to draw a diagram of them first and then see if it's possible to actually make it. So this tells that the Gauss code I just plugged in is in fact a numbat. It resolves to an open loop. That's very useful because turn to some of those Rasmussen string figures from the copper Inuit. This one is much more involved, much more complex. I gave it a Gauss code. It has 89 unique crossings. Actually, do this all by hand. It takes a while, as you can imagine. And then we can plug that into the string figure analyzer. It uses something called the Reidemeister moves from knot theory to solve it. And you can actually solve it and say this illustration that they've drawn from the fifth tool expedition is actually perfect. There's not a single mistake. So I think that kind of speaks for the attention that the ethnographers were paying to this art. So we can prove that this is in fact correctly Gauss coded. But if only life were so nice. So there's a challenge involved. Like I said, the base point and the orientation. We used point A here before to that direction. They're all arbitrary choices. And that's an issue because you could, start from point B and go to that direction, or from point C into that direction. And in fact, for the Jacob's ladder alone, accounting for that, you could also be viewing it from the other side, from the maker's perspective, not the viewer's perspective. You have 216 possible ways of giving this string figure Gauss code. And that's an issue because if you're sifting through these ethnographic archives, and you might encounter the string figure, for instance, pictured here, but it could also be pictured as a mirror image like that, or upside down, or whatever direction. And there's no systematic way of giving it just one Gauss code. So what we did to solve this issue is kind of a brute force solution. So we developed this algorithm called the Gauss coder that actually you give it one Gauss code and it spits out all the possible ways of Gauss coding this one string figure with the Gauss code. So you end up with this long string of numbers. Basically, you're representing the string figure with a string of numbers, which is very nice and convenient. So in the case of the Jacob's ladder, for instance, you actually represent it with almost 12,000 numbers. So if you're interested in the nitty-gritty, what we use then to analyze that string is q-grams, and then take the cosine distance between those strings. But in more lay terms, what's actually happening is a kind of pattern matching. So if you take, for instance, these two string figures, which are clearly very similar, and you can look for these sequences of patterns that occur in both, and then this system will just start pattern matching across them. And because these are quite similar, then they will have a low distance, a low cosine distance. That's just a nice way of quantifying the similarity of string figures. So you can say that, for instance, this string figure is 0.3 different to that one, which is very useful. In fact, you don't have to restrict yourself to string figures because you can do this to just about any object made of string. You can Gauss code, for instance, this is the Anklanet, one of the earliest fishing nets known to us from what used to be in eastern Finland, here documented by Sakari Palsi in 1920. So I think this method can actually, I won't talk about this much, but it can be generalized to various other domains. But here we're studying string figures, so let's return to that. So now we have all that stuff, those numbers and distance metrics. You can actually plug that into a hierarchical clustering engine, and you can produce a tree of string figures. So here, each of the clades at the outermost section of the circle actually all contain identical sets of string figures. So for instance, here you have the Jacob's ladder and all the Jacob's ladders in our dataset. And nearby clades, nearby clusters will have similar string figures. So across our data set, we had 826 string figures. And from that, we found 83 string figure structures that occurred in more than one culture. And of those 83, actually 49 had a what I would call a geographically interesting or a restricted distribution, as in they only appear, the structure of string figures only appears within a set of cultures that are either very geographically proximate or are culturally related. And that, to me, I think is a kind of obvious signal that there's a lot of cultural transmission happening within this data set. just one more little methodological thing, and then we're good to go. We can actually also use this numerical string system to measure the complexity of string figures. In the most basic form, you could say that both these figures, for instance, have 16 crossings. They do. So they would be kind of equivalent, but actually you'll notice that one of them is perfectly asymmetrical and the other has these quadrants of symmetry. And actually what happens here is that if you're using the same movement on both hands all the time, you're producing a symmetrical string figure, whereas the other one, you will use different movements on different hands to produce it. So actually it's a lot more difficult to make an asymmetrical figure. It's often said so by string figure hobbyists than a symmetrical one. So what you can do is basically just compress that numerical string I showed before, and that'll actually punish for symmetry because you have a lot of repetition, a lot of redundancy. So you'll need less information to define or compress a symmetrical string figure. So basically you just have the compressed file size of this figure versus that one. You'll notice this one is over twice more complex than the simple one, even though they have the same amount of processes. So that'll be useful for points I'll return to in a bit. The median complexity, I should say, is of our dataset is 2.11. So the string figure on the top there is kind of representative of an average string figure, I would say, in our dataset. So now we are, I think, equipped to return to the persistent question of cultural transmission or the cultural transmission of string figures. So just from the aggregate, like from a bird's eye view, if you look at the geographical distribution of identical pairs of string figures, you'll notice that there's a peak here in the kind of 0 to 5,000 kilometer range, which would suggest that that similar string figures appear in proximate cultures, whereas for all other string figures, it's a more kind of normal type distribution. And here I've overlaid them. So you can see that there's definitely something happening here in the geographical distribution of identical pairs of string figures.
Wait, what's the two colors?
These are identical. Oh yeah, I can see. It's blocked.
You can click that away actually. If you just click on OK, that bar should disappear.
Do that. Yeah, identical pairs of string figures and all other pairs of string figures. It's a bit unintuitive, and it's actually not that interesting. I think the more interesting part is getting into the nitty-gritty of what's happening here and the actual details of the data. So I said that we had something in the order of 50 geographically, I would say, interesting clades of string figures, and we can actually start zooming in and having a little look at what's happening there. So one example, I think, is this one. This I have labeled now Roope. That's after its name in Kiribati. But you'll notice that it only appears in the color blue here signifies Oceania, basically. It only appears, even though it's relatively, actually not a very complex string figure. It only appears in cultures with well-attested cultural ties. There's just one example, the Akan, that's from Ghana. That's actually, it actually is a bit different, but that's just one outlier here. So you have this relatively simple string figure, but it only appears in our data set in these cultures with historical ties. It's actually associated with a variety of origin stories. Actually, now Roope himself in Kiribati folklore or religion was an early kind of deity who lived at the kind of birth of the world and was creating string figures when the world was created. Even though it's the same structure appears only in this set of cultures, actually it's made in a variety of ways. So I can make it in one way. This is the true Roope way. It's made by a mouth loop, so I can't talk. So, and then it's finished with this extension that's called the Caroline extension. And this is actually like you pinch it between your finger and present it. And this is, I would call it like, it's like a design philosophy of making string figures. And that only appears in Oceania, in the Pacific, in Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, and also interestingly, Australia. So that's also like, I would say, a signifier that something cultural transmission-ish is definitely happening here, that you have the same way of making string figures. But it can be made in a variety of ways, actually. A more complex example is Takapo. That's, I believe, Maori or mat. And I'm told that it's not just any mat, it's not just takapau, it's actually takapau nuku, which is a birthing mat, which would again be associated with some kind of origin story of the birth of humankind. And again, this, it's finished with that same, oh, sorry, a mistake. It's made with that same Caroline extension. I shouldn't talk when I'm making a string figure. As you can see, it takes a while to make. It's a bit more complex than the other ones. There we go. But yeah, again, you see this string figure only in cultures that are well proved to have historical ties, and it's fairly complex. So I think it's obvious that this is shared cultural knowledge in this region. But also this one, you see a lot of patterns of innovation here, because this one is also made with 4 different openings in this area. So it's not just transmission, but there's also innovation happening here. Or a North American example, same kind of story, appears only in relatively proximate cultures in the western regions of North America. Yeah, I think I'll just move on here. Or a more, I think, even more telling case is the whole story with Arctic string figures. So here you have the hare or the caribou. It's known by both names across the Arctic, from Chukotka to Greenland, actually, so all across the American Arctic, from Siberia to Greenland. It's very typical to Arctic string figures. Again, it's made with opening A, but it's typical because it represents an animal and it's asymmetrical like that, but also because you can set it in motion. So you can actually make it and then make it and kind of move it and rewind it. And in fact, it's associated with the story where when it moves far enough, then it disappears like that. And that's something you see in a lot of Inuit, a lot of Yupik, Chukchi, Aleut string figures, is that they're associated with these stories. So for here, this is one of my favorite string figures. It's the swan. Again, animal form, asymmetrical. You'll actually, what happens here, if I would release my little finger there, then it'll appear to take flight and leave behind an empty pond, which is the story that it's associated with. Or the most, I think, complex string figure of all traditional string figures, the whale and the fox. That's kind of the elusive, super complex string figure that you should aspire to make as a string figure maker. I can make that, I can show it clearly. Again, it's associated with a story of a whale and a fox in this case. Yeah, you can plot those on a map, and like I said, it's quite obvious that you'll see these geographical clusters. You have Naugwebwe and Takapau, I showed over there, and then many stars there, and the herring, you know, and it's quite obvious that they have this specific cultural clustering. Yet there are some string figures like the one with the black squares here that are truly global, and that's actually the Jacob's ladder. Now, this is a very famous string figure, and in our data set, it's actually the most common string figure. It's found in 26 cultures in our data set, which is amazing. We had like 93 cultures in total. It's not an especially simple one, and that's what throws me off, because you would assume that if you find this one string figure everywhere, maybe it's just so simple that everyone's going to make it. But actually, it's not very simple. So you start with opening A. I mean, it's not super complex, but it's. And then you follow it like that, and like that. And then you do this. This is called Navajoing. And you end up here. And this is what really throws me off. Like you're here. And so what are you going to do next? And you actually do this inversion like that, which is like a move that beginners usually find quite challenging. And these 26 societies in our data set actually all use versions of that same method to make it. So, you know, they're all using basically the same method. There's one exception from South America where they use a wrist loop opening instead of opening A, but otherwise it's the same halfway through. Cultures that are very distant are making the same string figure in the same way. What on earth is happening? It's not super simple either. Now you could argue, and I think you should argue at some point that, yeah, maybe there's just a cultural attractor. People are just attracted in the 4 diamonds. But then we have tons of 4-diamond string figures like these here. I call them pseudo Jacob ladders, these two. They're very, very similar. In fact, they have very just minute differences to Jacob's ladder, especially this one. Yet they only appear in 1 or 2 cultures in our data set. Like it's not, I think that really the kind of attractor hypothesis doesn't hold a lot of water because of that. So what if string figures might have some quite deep ancestry? What if these string figures actually, at least many of them, might have a common ancestry? That might sound preposterous to some, but actually we know for a fact that string figures have existed for 2,000 years at least. So this is the Plintios brokos. It's documented by the Greek physician Heracles. It's a medical knot used in ancient Greece. Can you make it? It was actually used to fix a broken jaw. So you can see it forms this kind of diamond, and then you would place that under your jaw to hold your jaw and then tie these loops around your head. But you know that this has existed for 2,000 years. It actually uses that same opening A that's used to make Jacob's ladder, which is interesting also. Then going further back, we know, or with some certainty, I think, I'm not an archaeologist, so I can't really comment on this, but by Joseph Meyer et al. Have argued that even as far away as 160 to 120,000 years ago, you see evidence of perforated shells or beads like this showing wear of string being strung between them or through them. And of course, if you have beads that have holes in them, that implies the existence of a loop hole. So that would suggest that even like 160,000 years ago, there was some kind of string loop available, not necessarily cordage, but maybe sinew string or something else, which doesn't matter. You can make string figures with sinew as well. And then 73,000 years ago, you have this kind of symbolic behavior. I'm not saying it represents a string figure, but it is very much like a string figure in the kinds of symbols. So you have people attracted to symbols that you find in string figures, and you have string around 73,000 years ago. So in that context, I wouldn't say like it's definitely not impossible that someone would have been like, hey, you know, we have this loop of string, maybe let's make an opening A and see what happens. Which I think is just a precursor to really trying to take seriously this idea that some of these string figures might actually have very deep ancestry, and it's not something that we should outright dismiss, at least. And then finally, to the last topic at hand. So I mentioned early on in the talk when I was making that first string figure, that string figures have a very kind of algorithmic nature to them. I showed that using knot theory, you can actually study string figures. So string figures actually embody a lot of this kind of mathematical thinking. You have algorithms, you have geometry. This is, by the way, a wonderful string figure documented by Jane. That's originates from Nauru. So you have algorithms, geometry, you have complex topology, and even, for instance, in the case of Nauru, string figures are used as a kind of competitive mind sport. So you have like the string figure Olympics of that island where people compete and try to make the most amazing string figures. But regarding algorithms, this one is actually super interesting, the string figure, because it uses an algorithm, if we may, called, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, and that's something that's found throughout Micronesia. It's like you start with a different kind of opening, and then you apply this about 15-step algorithm, and you come up with all kinds of different string figures. So it's like a very kind of generalizable way of thinking about string figures. That's especially common in Nauru. And so I think it's worth also thinking about string figures as kind of catalysts for the emergence of mathematical thinking. So maybe, you know, if you ever work with knots, you'll know that there's a very restricted space of making knots. That's actually something we found in our upcoming knot study, is that humans are making the same knots just about everywhere. And that's because knots can't fail. You need a good knot to make a good net, and once you have that, they're kind of done. Whereas string figures really allow for this kind of experimentation, this kind of handling and mangling with string and kind of sparking your imagination further and trying to make more and more elaborate constructs. So this is kind of the field of study that I'm interested in right now, ethnotopology, I call it, and that's what I hope to work on in the near future. So the idea here would be, for instance, that maybe, you know, humans started playing with string figures thousands of years ago, and this sparked imagination in all kinds of technological advances like the emergence of, who knows, fishing nets. Often it's assumed that string figures emerged as an offshoot from fishing nets because they're, I suppose, like quite similar looking. But actually, if you truly think about it, there's no reason to assume that it goes that way because the medium, the string loop, and the operations have existed for much longer than fishing nets, which have only existed for about 10,000 years, or at least we have proof of them from that time period. So, what's next? I would definitely like to continue the study of string figures, maybe run some analysis more locally in the Arctic Pacific, for instance. I know there's a lot of experimental people here in this institute, so maybe this could be a good opportunity to develop some experimental settings around string figures, maybe transmission chains or something like that. One thing that really interests me is like, what if, like, hypothetical scenario, you put just people with no experience of string figures on an island, what kind of stuff would they come up with? You know, would opening A emerge, and so on? Would Jacob's ladder emerge? I don't think so. And finally, string figures already were a rapidly disappearing form of art 100 years ago when they were first described by Western ethnographers, and even more so today. This tradition has almost disappeared in most of the world. So I think it's just important for cultural heritage itself to be documenting these. And like I said, there's a whole other paper coming on similar study of knots, braids, textiles, fishing nets, whatever. And that's it. Thank you very much.